Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to offer Dana, then please do go to justthiszen.org/giving. Your support really does make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
So yeah, it's lovely to see all you dear people. And I was looking at the list just before we came online and feeling slightly overwhelmed that all you lovely people and dedicated practitioners have come to support me. So many thanks for that. And actually just looking at all of your faces during Zazen was really helpful. A special welcome to Liam and Nina, who are somewhat new to this practice, and a big thanks to Maria for her offering to provide tech support this evening. Thank you, Maria. So, why did I choose this topic? Zazen as a gateway to the restoration of joy. I decided I was only going to offer these evenings if an idea arose within me that I felt excited about. And when I happened upon this topic, what made me feel excited was the fact that we don't really speak very much in Zen about what's going on inside us all when we sit in Zazen. It almost feels like a bit of a secret or something. And I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to invite people to speak about what happens within their mind and their being when they're sitting? I'm fascinated by the contrast between the outward impression of somebody sitting in Zazen and knowing that the drama and storms that might be raging within, and the contrast between those two things. I've often thought it would be brilliant to do a film project that involves filming long-time practitioners' faces close up through a sitting and then speeding it up to catch any little hints of some of the things that are going on within. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. Perhaps it's been done. I don't know. If anyone fancies doing it, feel free to pinch my idea. So, although we often interchange the words Zazen and meditation, as you know, there's many different techniques and flavours of meditation. And Zazen's quite different to many other approaches in the sense that the emphasis is on the very act of sitting upright rather than any particular technique. In our Sangha, we usually sit for half an hour at a time with no emphasis on any particular technique or object of meditation. There's nothing wrong with having an object, an anchor, such as the breath or body sensations to bring us back to the present moment. I do still use that sometimes, but understanding Zazen is understanding that we do not do it. So this is a quote from somebody called Domio Burke from an article called How to Develop Your Zen Practice. And Domio says, techniques are ways to counteract the strong habitual tendency of our minds to try to be productive, entertained, or satisfied, even when we've decided not to act on any of our thoughts. You might say the techniques decrease your doing level, because a simple technique like following your breath involves much less mental activity than brainstorming a new project for work. In this sense, techniques can make the circumstances more conducive to doing nothing. But mostly, I think we give meditation techniques because people need to feel like they're doing something, anything. Heck, make me do something as boring and unproductive as counting my breath, but at least I can imagine it's good for me and try to do a really good job of it. Anything but nothing. On a retreat with Flint once in the very early days, we gathered for the morning session and were waiting for Flint, and he didn't appear. when we were due to start sitting. That's the first and last time, by the way, that's ever happened when I've been with Flint. So we sat quietly, but the Zazen period did not officially start. As I was sitting, I realised that I was waiting for the bell to ring so that I could start meditating. And I'd just been simply sitting. I realised that this was a really useful insight, that I clearly had some sort of idea of how to do Zazen. And I was certain Flint had purposely waited and been late to teach us that valuable lesson. I think something else had happened, I can't remember what, but it wasn't a purposeful teaching, but it worked for me. So we can see that not getting attached to a particular technique makes sense. Not becoming dependent upon one object, such as the breath or a mantra, because that's doing something. Also, it's amazing how quickly our minds start looking for achievements. We want to become good at the things that we practice. And Zazen is not something we can conquer. So Flint sometimes tells a story of going to his teacher Blanche for practice discussion and sharing how he'd had a really good Zazen experience. And she was unusually stern with him. She said, "Never think that you do Zazen. Zazen does Zazen." A very Zen thing to say, and perhaps a koan. I'm not exactly sure what Zazen does Zazen means, but I take the point that Zazen is not something that we do. In Zen, we often talk about cultivating beginner's mind, and that's another reason why I want to explore Zazen. When you've been practicing for quite a long time, as some of us have, my experience is that you can easily develop habitual ways of being. So for those of you that are fairly new to this, you've got a bit of an advantage. You've got beginner's mind. Certainly the small amount of instruction we get, keep it simple, focus on posture, maintain an open awareness, means that having let go of getting too focused on one particular technique, I can sometimes wonder what on earth to do to stay present, even now, after many years of practice. And of course, the point is that we are not trying not to do, or we're not trying. It's really hard to talk about. Like everything in Zen, it's really simple and impossible to grasp. So here's a quote that I absolutely love so much that I transcribed it, and it's another quote. It's a quote from Flint, and it's from a podcast interview that he did. The podcast is called "I'm Awake, Now What?" By the way, I'll be giving you the sources of the quotes and the resources in an email after the session, so no need to write anything down. So this is a quote from Flint. A lot of people will say, "I'm going to meditate," when what they mean is they're going to engage in some activity as an attempt to manipulate their mind, their consciousness, their breathing, their body, in a way that they think is better than the one they live with all the time. And if they continue the form of manipulation long enough, they will become awake. But if you simply sit and stop and relinquish all manipulation of any sort, that's true meditation. That's not easy. It sounds simple because you're not doing anything, but as anyone that's ever tried it knows, it's not that easy just to sit still in the midst of all the things your body does and all the things your mind does, and with some dignity and some stillness, and not strive to do something else. I can tell you that almost every single retreat that I do, I begin with a simple instruction, which is a very, very simple question. How simple are you willing to let this be? Sometimes I use the term open awareness to try to describe or differentiate between Zazen and other meditations, other forms of meditation. And I'm not trying to sort of promote Zazen above anything else. You know, there's lots of different approaches, and they're all valid and they're all useful. But I'm going to share something Flint said in an early retreat, as it might be helpful. If I remember rightly, I think he was talking about the difference between a practice which involves an objective awareness, the breath, for example, or listening to sounds or noticing body sensations, versus an open awareness where your attention is open to whatever arises, both internally and externally. And he used the analogy for the former of a spotlight for the former and a floodlight for the latter. I found this very helpful, this sort of switch, this idea of a switch from a spotlight focused attention to a floodlight. And by the way, our very own Lynn, who is here, was on that retreat, and she shared with us all what sounded like a profound momentary shift when Flint gave that instruction around moving your awareness from a spotlight to a floodlight. I asked Lynn about this, and she was kind enough to let me share what she said. She said, "It was unforgettable as an experience, though I do not look for it to happen again. It reverberates through me still, like a colour that's impossible to describe." Thank you for your teaching, Lynn. Whilst talk of enlightenment sometimes seen as a state to attain, many teachings point to enlightenment as a momentary awakening and not a personal achievement. As Suzuki Roshi says, strictly speaking, there's no enlightened people, there's only enlightened activity. When Lynn says she does not look for her experience to happen again, she's pointing out the pitfall of grasping to an experience. I think one reason Lynn's experience stayed with me is because I was awed, but also a little bit envious at the time. I wanted to have that experience. One of the most powerful things that sitting practice shows us is our preferences and the way we want to cling to experiences that make us feel good and avoid pain and discomfort. We stay in our seat and feel the discomfort, the irritation, the dissatisfaction, and we often yearn to attain some sort of fantasy of enlightenment, which we think would mean that we would never have to experience pain, discontent, discomfort, irritation. The bad news is that will never happen. We'll continue to experience those thoughts and feelings. The good news is that all we have to do is keep on being willing to sit, to quote Flint again, in the midst of all the things your body does and all the things your mind does, and with some dignity and some stillness, sit over and over again. Suzuki Roshi again. When you are practicing Zazen, do not try to stop your thinking. Let it stop by itself. If something comes into your mind, let it come in and let it go out. It will not stay long. I find the most difficult thing when talking about Zazen is to encourage people to persist whilst not focusing too much on the benefits. The reason for that is that we'll quickly turn practice into a kind of training to become somebody else, somewhere else, a results-based activity as part of a self-improvement program, because that's how we've been conditioned to think. The truth is, in my experience, that it's the practice of returning to your seat over and over again that's more important than the quality of your Zazen. It's the sitting upright and still in the midst of all that's going on within and without that makes the difference over time. After some time of practicing regularly, I really began to notice in Zazen how many of my thoughts were my mind's way of trying to maintain a solid identity. This helped me notice the times I was unnecessarily defensive in my relationships. This doesn't mean not having good, healthy boundaries, but what I mean is it helped me notice when defensiveness was causing me suffering and was a sort of illusion to try and protect my idea of some sort of solid, separate identity would create a barrier in relationships. So when I spot that, it can be really helpful. Norman Fisher says, as you continue meditating, you see that your sense of self is not as fixed as you once believed it was. Rather than being some essence of meanness that is somehow inside you or enclosing you, you see that your sense of self is a fluid series of experiences, impressions, feelings, attitudes. You begin to see how much of a burden it has been to try to shore all of that up into a concept of me that you have spent your life defending, justifying, building up, and sometimes self-destructively and painfully tearing down without realising you were doing this. You realise that much of that wasn't necessary, that your me never needed defending in the first place. You come to know that your pain has not come from the me itself, but from your clutching it so tightly, and that once you relax your hold, you find peace. And again, just for the sake of clarity, I just want to emphasise again that this is not about not having good boundaries and just lying down and submitting to anything. It's more about the ways we unnecessarily and painfully try to defend this sort of solid idea of who we think we are, thus limiting ourselves. So in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to meet in pairs and share some of the things that you find yourself doing when sitting. But first, it's only fair to share some of mine. There's nothing wrong with using techniques, whilst knowing this is a spotlight rather than a floodlight. And one I used to use a lot early on to zoom out of my thoughts was to notice the kind of thoughts that were habitual to me. So noticing what kind of thoughts there were more than the content themselves. And I discovered that I was a massive planner. I could plan whole parties in my head, write stories, have conversations with people, devise menus, shopping lists, on and on and on. This is still my default now. When I finally manage to interrupt the planning meeting in my head, I return to my present moment experience. This can happen many, many times in one 30-minute sitting. I also still find myself trying to find something to do in my sitting practice. It can be a way of grasping again to get myself into a pleasant state by being grateful or thinking about loved ones. There's nothing wrong with any of this, by the way, whatever you do or don't do. I'm just sharing some of my internal workings. I find that on retreat, staying present with what arises, without getting lost in a story, begins to come more readily. And that simply happens without effort because I'm sitting for so long on a retreat. I guess my mind begins to exhaust itself with all the thinking. On the most recent retreat, almost every time I caught myself in an ungenerous thought towards myself or another, I felt able to interrupt the story, the content, and then I'd notice the emotion and the bodily feeling behind this story. And that stayed with me. So I'm now going to ask Maria to put us into breakout rooms in pairs and share our own experience of sitting. So what happens for you internally? What are your habits? Remember, there's no right or wrong, so share as much or as little as you feel comfortable doing. We'll take 10 minutes or so, and when we come back, there'll be a little time in the big group for comments or questions before our final sitting.